Imagine France in the late 18th century, a society rigidly structured by tradition and hierarchy. While the Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity were gaining traction, these concepts largely excluded women. Legally and socially, women were considered subordinate to men, their lives primarily confined to the domestic sphere. Yet, as the French Revolution erupted in 1789, women from all walks of life would step out of the shadows, challenging these limitations and playing crucial, often overlooked, roles in the tumultuous events that reshaped the nation. For most women in pre-revolutionary France, life was defined by their social class. Imagine the lives of peasant women, toiling tirelessly in the fields alongside their families, their days dictated by the agricultural seasons and the demands of survival. Their contributions to the rural economy were essential, yet their voices were rarely heard in the corridors of power. In the cities, imagine the lives of working-class women, market vendors, seamstresses, laundresses, laboring long hours to support themselves and their families. They were often at the forefront of economic hardship, their livelihoods vulnerable to price fluctuations and social unrest. It was these women, facing the daily struggles of poverty and scarcity, who would become some of the earliest and most vocal participants in the revolution. Even among the middle and upper classes, women's roles were largely circumscribed. Imagine the lives of bourgeois women, often confined to managing the household and raising children, their intellectual and political aspirations stifled by societal expectations. While some had access to education and engaged in salon culture, their influence was generally informal and indirect. However, the intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment did spark a growing awareness among some women of the injustices they faced. Imagine early feminist thinkers like Olympe de Gouges beginning to articulate arguments for women's rights and equality, challenging the prevailing patriarchal norms. While their numbers were small, their ideas would lay the groundwork for the more active participation of women in the revolution. As the political climate in France grew increasingly volatile in the late 1780s, with economic hardship, social inequality, and political deadlock fueling discontent, women found themselves directly affected by the unfolding crisis. Imagine the bread riots and protests over food shortages, where women, often responsible for feeding their families, took to the streets to demand action. These early acts of collective action demonstrated the growing political consciousness and agency of women. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, a pivotal moment in the revolution, also saw the participation of women, although their contributions are often overshadowed in traditional accounts. Imagine women alongside men, fueled by anger and a desire for change, joining the crowds that attacked this symbol of royal authority. As the revolution progressed, women began to organize and articulate their demands more formally. Imagine the formation of women's clubs and societies, providing spaces for political discussion and the development of female leadership. These clubs became vital platforms for women to voice their concerns and advocate for their rights within the revolutionary framework. The early stages of the French Revolution, while not explicitly focused on women's rights, created an environment where traditional hierarchies were being questioned. This provided an opening for women to assert themselves as active citizens and to demand recognition for their contributions to the revolutionary cause. The daughters of the revolution were beginning to make their voices heard, and their impact would be far more significant than often acknowledged. Imagine Paris in the autumn of 1789, a city simmering with revolutionary fervor, but also gripped by economic crisis. Food shortages, particularly the scarcity and high price of bread, the staple of the Parisian diet, were causing immense hardship and fueling widespread anger, especially among working-class women, who bore the primary responsibility for feeding their families. It was these women, the market sellers, the laundresses, the laborers of the city, who became the driving force behind some of the revolution's most significant early actions. Imagine them gathering in the streets, their frustration and desperation reaching a boiling point, as bakeries ran empty and prices soared beyond their reach. These spontaneous gatherings often erupted into forceful protests, sometimes targeting bakers and officials perceived to be hoarding grain. The most dramatic example of women's direct action in this period was the March on Versailles, on October 5, 1789. Imagine a large and determined crowd, predominantly women from the markets and working-class districts of Paris, fueled by rumors of royal hoarding of grain and a deep distrust of the monarchy. They began to march the 12 miles to the Palace of Versailles, their numbers swelling as they went. This was not a polite petition. Imagine these women, many of whom had walked for hours in the rain, arriving at the opulent palace demanding bread and action from King Louis XVI. They were not just pleading, they were assertive and angry, their voices honed by the daily struggle for survival. Their presence at Versailles was a direct confrontation with the symbols of royal power and privilege. The March on Versailles was a pivotal moment. Imagine the chaos and tension as these determined women surrounded the palace, their demands echoing through the gilded halls. They confronted the royal family directly, their anger fueled by the perceived indifference of the monarchy to their suffering. Some even broke into the palace, their fury palpable. The outcome of the march was significant. Imagine the royal family being compelled to leave Versailles and accompany the crowd back to Paris. This forced relocation effectively placed the king and queen under the watchful eye of the Parisian populace and significantly diminished royal authority. The women of Paris had directly influenced the course of the revolution, demonstrating their political agency and power. The March on Versailles was not an isolated incident. Imagine women continuing to participate actively in the revolution at the grassroots level. They attended political meetings, joined revolutionary clubs, and engaged in public debate. Their voices, though often marginalized by male revolutionaries, were a constant presence in the unfolding events. These working-class women, often driven by the immediate needs of survival, brought a practical and urgent perspective to the revolution. Imagine their focus on issues like food security and price controls, concerns that directly impacted their daily lives and the well-being of their families. Their activism challenged the more abstract political theories being debated in the National Assembly, grounding the revolution in the realities of everyday life. The bread riots and the March on Versailles stand as powerful examples of how women, particularly those from the most marginalized sectors of society, could become catalysts for profound political change. Their actions demonstrated their courage, their determination, and their crucial role in shaping the early course of the French Revolution. They were not passive bystanders, they were active agents in the fight for a new France. Imagine the vibrant intellectual landscape of revolutionary France, where new ideas about liberty, equality, and citizenship were being fiercely debated and articulated in pamphlets, newspapers, and philosophical treatises. While the voices of male thinkers often dominate this historical narrative, a number of remarkable women writers and thinkers emerged as powerful voices for change, challenging the exclusion of women from the revolutionary ideals. One of the most iconic of these figures was Olympe de Gouges. Imagine this self-educated playwright and political activist fearlessly publishing her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen in 1791. This groundbreaking document was a direct response to the National Assembly's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, pointedly exposing its failure to include women in its promises of equality. De Gouges systematically rewrote each article of the male declaration to include women, arguing for their equal rights in all spheres of life, from politics and property ownership to education and divorce. Imagine the audacity of her challenge to the prevailing patriarchal norms. She advocated for women's suffrage, the right to hold public office, equal legal standing in marriage, and access to education, ideas that were radical for their time. Her writings were not just theoretical. She actively engaged in political debate, expressing her views on the course of the revolution and criticizing those she believed were undermining its ideals, regardless of their power. Another influential figure was Madame de Staël, also known as Anne-Louise Guemin-Necker. Imagine this prominent salonnière and writer wielding considerable intellectual influence through her insightful political analyses and novels. While not as explicitly focused on women's rights as Olympe de Gouges, her writings explored themes of individual liberty and challenged the excesses of the revolution, offering a nuanced perspective on the unfolding events. Her salon became a hub for intellectual discussion, where women played a significant role in shaping political discourse. Consider also the contributions of women journalists and pamphleteers, who, though often less famous today, played a vital role in disseminating revolutionary ideas and mobilizing public opinion. Imagine women writing for the burgeoning revolutionary press, expressing their political views, reporting on events, and advocating for various causes, including greater rights for women. The debates surrounding women's roles in the revolution extended to the realm of education. Imagine women arguing for equal access to education, believing that an informed citizenry required the education of both men and women. Thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft, though British, had a significant influence on French feminist thought, advocating for women's rational education and their right to participate fully in public life. These intellectual firebrands faced significant challenges and often risked persecution for their outspoken views. Imagine Olympe de Gouges, ultimately being guillotined for her political activism and her critiques of Robespierre. Their courage and determination to articulate and fight for women's rights in the midst of a violent revolution are a testament to their commitment to the ideals of equality. The writings and ideas of these women writers and thinkers provided a crucial intellectual foundation for the burgeoning feminist movement. They challenged the inherent sexism of the revolution's early promises and laid the groundwork for future generations to continue the fight for women's emancipation. Their contributions, though sometimes marginalized in traditional histories, were essential in shaping the intellectual and political landscape of the French Revolution and its long-term legacy. Imagine the French Revolution, not just as a battle of ideas, but as a period of intense physical upheaval, with street riots, insurrections, and even open warfare. While often portrayed as a male affair, women from various social classes actively participated in these more direct and sometimes violent forms of revolutionary action, demonstrating their commitment to the cause and their willingness to fight for change. We've already seen the powerful example of the market women marching on Versailles. Imagine this spirit of direct action extending to other pivotal moments of the revolution. During the storming of the Bastille, while the primary assault force was male, accounts suggest women were present in the crowds, urging on the attackers, and even participating in the fighting. Their presence underscored the widespread popular anger against royal authority. As the revolution intensified, women continued to be visible in the streets of Paris and other cities. Imagine them participating in the various journées, the days of popular uprising that punctuated the revolutionary calendar. They joined crowds, demanding political change, protesting against counter-revolutionaries, and sometimes engaging in confrontations with royalist or conservative elements. The formation of revolutionary militias and citizen armies also saw some, albeit limited, female participation. Imagine women, often from the working classes, arming themselves with pikes, knives, and even firearms, ready to defend the revolution against perceived enemies. While they were generally not formally enlisted in large numbers, their presence in local militias and their willingness to fight demonstrated their commitment to the revolutionary cause. The Women's March on Versailles provides a powerful image of women acting as a collective force, driven by economic necessity and political will. Imagine this collective action being replicated on a smaller scale, in local communities, where women organized to address issues like food supply, counter-revolutionary activity, and the welfare of revolutionary soldiers. Some women even distinguished themselves through individual acts of bravery and militancy. Imagine figures like Théron de Méricourt, a charismatic and controversial woman who became a visible presence in the Parisian political scene. She was known for her fiery speeches and her active participation in revolutionary crowds, even allegedly leading attacks on perceived enemies of the revolution. While her role remains debated and sometimes sensationalized, she embodies the active and sometimes violent involvement of women. The role of women in the Vendée War, a counter-revolutionary uprising in western France, also highlights their active participation in armed conflict, albeit on opposing sides. Imagine women fighting alongside royalist forces, motivated by religious conviction and opposition to the revolutionary government. This demonstrates that women were not a monolithic group in their political allegiances, and were willing to take up arms for their beliefs, regardless of which side they supported. It's important to acknowledge that the participation of women in armed revolutionary action was often met with resistance and criticism, even from within revolutionary circles. Imagine male revolutionaries debating the proper role of women in the new republic, often arguing that their place was in the domestic sphere, nurturing future citizens, rather than on the battlefield or in the political arena. Despite these limitations and criticisms, the active participation of women in the physical struggles of the French Revolution cannot be denied. They were not simply passive observers, they were agents of change, willing to take to the streets, arm themselves, and fight for the ideals they believed in, leaving an undeniable mark on the course of the revolution. Imagine the burgeoning political landscape of revolutionary France,
where new ideas and ideologies were debated in countless assemblies and clubs. Women excluded from formal political bodies like the National Assembly found their own avenues for political organization and advocacy, forming clubs and societies that became vital spaces for discussion, mobilization, and the articulation of their demands. Inspired by the male Jacobin and Cordelier clubs, women began to establish their own political clubs across France, particularly in Paris. Imagine these clubs as vibrant centers of female political engagement. They provided platforms for women to debate the issues of the day, analyze revolutionary decrees, and formulate their own political agendas. Women actively participated in these meetings, delivering speeches, proposing resolutions, and corresponding with other clubs. These women's clubs were diverse in their membership and their specific aims. Imagine working-class women organizing to address issues like food prices and economic hardship, while middle-class women focused on broader political rights and social reforms. Some clubs were explicitly feminist, advocating for women's suffrage, education, and legal equality, echoing the ideas of thinkers like Olympe de Gouges. One of the most prominent of these organizations was the Society of Revolutionary Republican Women, founded in 1793. Imagine this club as a powerful force in Parisian politics, composed largely of working-class women who were fiercely committed to the revolution and actively sought to influence its direction. They advocated for strict measures against counter-revolutionaries, participated in public demonstrations, and even sought the right to bear arms to defend the Republic. Through these clubs, women articulated a range of demands. Imagine them petitioning the National Assembly on issues that directly affected their lives, such as the right to divorce, equal inheritance laws, and access to education. They challenged the prevailing notion of separate spheres for men and women, arguing for their inclusion as active citizens in the new republic. Women also used other forms of political advocacy. Imagine them writing petitions, publishing pamphlets, and participating in public debates in the galleries of the National Assembly, making their presence and opinions known even though they were not allowed to vote or hold office. Their voices, though often marginalized, were a constant undercurrent in the revolutionary discourse. The symbolic actions of women also played a significant role in their political advocacy. Imagine them participating in revolutionary festivals and ceremonies, donning revolutionary attire, and creating their own female symbolism to express their allegiance to the new republic and their aspirations for greater inclusion. However, the political activism of women was not universally welcomed, even by male revolutionaries. Imagine debates within the revolutionary government about the proper role of women in politics, with many arguing that their primary duty was to the home and the family. The radicalism of women's demands for full political equality often clashed with the more conservative views of some male leaders. Ultimately, the formal political organization of women faced suppression during the more radical phase of the revolution. Imagine the closure of women's clubs in 1793, with the Jacobin government arguing that women's political participation was disruptive to social order and contrary to their natural roles. This suppression marked a setback for the organized women's movement during the revolution. Despite this suppression, the experience of political organization and advocacy during the early years of the revolution had a lasting impact. Imagine the seeds of feminist consciousness being sown, and the precedent being set for women to actively engage in the political life of the nation. The women's clubs and their demands, though ultimately curtailed, demonstrated the political agency and aspirations of women during this transformative period. Imagine the initial fervor of the French Revolution, with its lofty ideals of liberty and equality, seemingly offering the promise of a more just society for all. However, as the revolution progressed and became increasingly radicalized, the limitations of this revolutionary equality for women became starkly apparent. Despite their active participation in various aspects of the upheaval, women found their political aspirations increasingly curtailed, and their roles ultimately confined to the domestic sphere by the dominant male revolutionaries. We've seen how women organized politically through clubs and societies, articulating their demands for greater rights. Imagine the initial hope and momentum of these movements being met with growing resistance from influential male figures within the revolutionary government. Many argued that women's natural role was within the family, nurturing future citizens, and that their involvement in the public and political sphere would disrupt social order and undermine the stability of the new republic. The debates over women's citizenship became increasingly contentious. Imagine the arguments against granting women full political rights, such as the right to vote and hold office. These arguments often drew upon Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau, who emphasized separate spheres for men and women, assigning men to the public realm of politics and women to the private realm of the home. Biological arguments about women's supposed emotionality and lack of rational capacity were also used to justify their exclusion from political life. The suppression of women's political organizations reached a critical point in the autumn of 1793. Imagine the Jacobin-dominated National Convention officially outlawing women's political clubs and societies. This decree effectively silenced organized female political voice and marked a significant setback for the burgeoning women's movement. The rationale given was that women's involvement in politics was divisive and contrary to their natural destiny. The fate of prominent female revolutionaries like Olympe de Gouges served as a stark warning to others. Imagine her courageous advocacy for women's rights, and her outspoken criticism of revolutionary leaders, ultimately leading to her arrest and execution in November 1793. Her death symbolized the dangers of challenging the established gender norms within the revolutionary context. Even the initial gains women had made in areas like divorce laws were later rolled back under the Napoleonic Code, which reinforced patriarchal authority within the family and further limited women's legal rights. Imagine the ideals of revolutionary equality giving way to a more conservative social order that reasserted male dominance. The emphasis on women's role as Republican mothers, responsible for instilling civic virtue in their sons, further confined women to the domestic sphere, albeit with a new civic duty. Imagine this ideal reinforcing the notion that women's contribution to the Republic was primarily through their roles as wives and mothers, rather than as direct participants in political life. The story of women in the French Revolution serves as a complex and often contradictory example of revolutionary change. Imagine their initial empowerment and active participation ultimately being met with the limits of the revolutionary ideology when it came to gender equality. While the revolution undoubtedly challenged many aspects of the old order, it largely failed to dismantle the deeply entrenched patriarchal structures of French society. Despite these setbacks and the ultimate suppression of their formal political participation, the women who shaped the French Revolution left a lasting legacy. Imagine their courageous actions, their intellectual contributions, and their early demands for equality serving as an inspiration for future generations of feminists who would continue the fight for women's rights and full citizenship. Their stories, often overlooked in traditional accounts, are a crucial reminder that the pursuit of liberty and equality must encompass all members of society.